He gave everything to build his son's future, until one sentence destroyed 30 years of sacrifice. What the father did next would make his ungrateful son wish he'd never spoken those words. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The honorary doctorate certificate sat heavy in its velvet presentation box as I navigated through the parking garage beneath Worthington Business. 33 years old, and my son Thaddeus was receiving the youngest ever honorary MBA from one of America's most prestigious institutions. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago, embossed gold lettering announcing the ceremony where my son would be celebrated for entrepreneurial excellence and innovative leadership. I'd paid for his actual MBA 12 years ago, $180,000 in tuition alone. But tonight was different. Tonight he'd supposedly earned this recognition through his own merit, building what business journals called a disruptive force in luxury real estate. The May evening carried Charleston's peculiar humidity as I entered the historic courtyard. String lights suspended between ancient oaks created an atmosphere of southern elegance. Perhaps 200 guests filled white folding chairs facing a temporary stage. I recognized Charleston's business elite, the mayor, city council members, executives from companies I'd competed against during 4 decades in commercial real estate. My seat was in the third row, not front row where immediate family typically sat, but close enough to see clearly. The placement stung, but I'd grown accustomed to Thaddeus's subtle hierarchies. His biological father might have built the fortune funding everything, but in his social calculations, I ranked below his business associates and considerably below his fiancée's family. Cornelius Ashford. Sophronia Blackwood settled beside me, her elegant gray suit and patrician features immediately recognizable. We'd served together on Charleston Historic Preservation Society's board for 15 years. I didn't realize Thaddeus was your son. How proud you must be. He's worked very hard, I replied. The diplomatic answer I'd perfected over years of people congratulating me on achievements I'd actually funded. The ceremony began with formal pageantry. Dean Whitmore spoke about visionary leadership. Student speakers praised honorary recipients with rehearsed enthusiasm. Then Thaddeus took the stage, and something in my chest tightened. He looked every inch the successful businessman in his Italian suit. But watching him accept the leather-bound certificate with that confident smile, I felt creeping unease. This was someone who'd never questioned whether he deserved these accolades. This honor represents more than personal achievement, Thaddeus began, his voice carrying perfectly. It represents the triumph of vision over convention, of innovation over inherited limitation. I shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the phrase from his recent Southern Business Magazine interview where he described his self-made success transcending his modest foundations. Thaddeus had grown up in an 8,000-square-foot Battery mansion, attended elite private schools, driven luxury vehicles from 16 onward, but in his public narrative, he was a scrappy entrepreneur who'd built everything through pure determination. I'm grateful to many who believed in my potential, Thaddeus continued, his gaze sweeping the audience, but never quite landing on the third row. My Harvard professors, my business partners who took chances, my beautiful fiancée, Ophelia, whose family's faith provided the critical early support I needed. Ophelia's family, the Vandermeer shipping fortune, had indeed provided $8 million in seed capital. What he didn't mention was the $12 million I'd quietly transferred to cover cost overruns when his innovative approach resulted in construction disasters. Most importantly, and here Thaddeus's voice took on practiced emotional resonance, I'm grateful to everyone who didn't limit my potential with their own fears. Success requires breaking free from those who can't envision what's possible. Wait. This is where everything changes. The audience applauded. Sophronia glanced at me with a strange expression, sympathy mixed with confusion. Had she just witnessed my son publicly dismissing his father's contributions? The ceremony concluded with champagne on the adjacent lawn. I stood alone near a catering table, watching Thaddeus hold court among admirers. His laugh carried across the grass that particular bark of amusement he employed when networking. "Mr. Ashford," a young graduate approached enthusiastically. "Your son is inspiring. Building his empire from nothing. No family money, no connections, just pure entrepreneurial brilliance." From nothing, the words echoed hollowly as I watched my son across the lawn, gesticulating animatedly. The Patek Philippe on his wrist, my father's watch given to Thaddeus for his 30th birthday, caught the evening light. "That's certainly one version," I said quietly. A commotion near the stage interrupted us. Thaddeus had climbed back onto the platform, champagne glass raised, preparing for an impromptu speech. The crowd quieted with practiced efficiency. "Before everyone leaves," Thaddeus called out, slightly looser from alcohol but still commanding, "I want to share something personal." He paused for effect. This recognition represents what's possible when you refuse to be defined by circumstance, when you reject limitations others try to impose. More approving murmurs. I set down my champagne, something cold settling into my stomach. "Some of us are born into situations that could have limited us," Thaddeus continued, and now his gaze found mine across the lawn. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something that made my breath catch. Not affection triumph. We have fathers who built small, safe lives, who never took real risks, who passed on fear disguised as wisdom. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people glanced toward me, recognition dawning as they realized who Thaddeus was describing. "You think that was revenge? No, that was just the beginning." The greatest gift, Thaddeus's voice carried with perfect clarity, would have been if those limiting influences had never existed. If I'd been born free to pursue vision without overcoming the gravitational pull of mediocrity. The words landed like a physical blow. I felt Sophronia's hand on my arm. Around us, Charleston's business community witnessed what would become the defining moment. My son's public declaration that my existence had been an obstacle he'd heroically overcome. Thaddeus raised his glass higher. "So here's to breaking free, to proving that vision triumphs over fear, and success belongs to those brave enough to claim it." The applause felt hollow, uncertain. People stared at their phones, calculating how to navigate this spectacular family rupture. Others looked at me with expressions ranging from sympathy to fascinated horror. I stood frozen, 68 years of dignity preventing me from making a scene. But inside, something fundamental shifted. The hurt was there, devastating pain of hearing your only child wish you'd never exist. But beneath that pain, something colder crystallized. Thaddeus climbed down, immediately surrounded by supporters, congratulating his powerful, honest speech. He accepted their praise with easy confidence, someone who'd never doubted that public humiliation of his father was acceptable for seeming bold. "Cornelius, leave now," Sophronia said gently but firmly. "Preserve your dignity." She was right. But as I turned toward the parking garage, my mind was already working differently. Not planning retreat, planning systematic dismantling. I built my first fortune at 32 by recognizing when an asset became a liability. Now at 68, that same clarity settled over my relationship with my son. Thaddeus wanted to be self-made, wanted success without his father's gravitational pull. Very well, it was time to give him exactly what he'd asked for, complete independence, but not through absence. Through systematic dismantling of every support structure I'd built, protecting him from consequences of his incompetence. The parking garage was cool and empty. I sat in the Mercedes that Thaddeus once dismissed as too understated for real wealth, hands steady on the steering wheel as I allowed tonight's humiliation to crystallize into a plan. Tomorrow, My attorney would receive a call. Estate documents needed immediate revision. The safety nets, trust provisions, carefully structured inheritance, all would be dismantled with the same precision I'd used constructing them. Thaddeus had publicly wished I'd never existed. Soon he'd understand what my non-existence meant in practical terms, not physical absence. That would be too easy. No, I would remain very much alive, watching from comfortable distance as his supposedly self-made empire collapsed under debts and obligations that only my quiet support had been keeping at bay. Justice was close, but not how anyone expected. Charleston's historic streets passed by as I drove home through neighborhoods I'd helped develop 40 years ago. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the hurt had been completely replaced by cold calculation. Tomorrow would begin the systematic destruction of everything Thaddeus believed he'd built independently. Tonight, I would allow myself one final moment as the generous father who'd enabled his delusions. That man was about to disappear. Not physically, but in every way that mattered to Thaddeus's carefully constructed fantasy of independence. The morning after arrived with Charleston humidity that made everything heavier. I'd slept poorly, my mind cycling through 33 years of financial records and the intricate web of support I'd woven around my son's empire. By 7 a.m., I sat at my desk with cold coffee beside 3 decades of organized files. The engineering precision that built my fortune now focused on dismantling my son's illusions with surgical accuracy. First call Montgomery Pemberton, my attorney, whose family had handled Ashford legal matters for 3 generations. Cornelius, Montgomery's voice carried alert concern. What's happened? Emergency revision of my estate documents. Complete restructuring by end of business today. A pause. Montgomery had witnessed enough family disasters to recognize irreversible decision. What prompted this? My son stated last night that the greatest gift would have been if I'd never existed. I'm granting his wish, financially speaking. I see. I'll clear my schedule. 2 hours. Second call. Harrison Blackwell, my private investigator. Though that undersold his capabilities, Harrison specialized in corporate intelligence. Mr. Ashford, how can I assist? Complete financial forensics on Thaddeus Ashford. Every loan, investor, obligation from the past 10 years. I want to know exactly where my support has been propping up his empire. How comprehensive. Assume hostile acquisition of a competitor. That level of detail. Harrison's low whistle conveyed understanding. Timeline. 48 hours preliminary. 7 days complete analysis. Consider it done, though given the family connection, this will be delicate. Mr. Blackwell, after last night there is no family connection, only a business relationship being terminated with extreme prejudice. Third call. Beauregard Whitmore, president of Magnolia Trust and Holdings, where Ashford assets had been managed since We'd known each other since prep school. Cornelius, I heard about last night. The business community is buzzing. I'm calling about immediate changes to accounts and guarantees. Sharp intake of breath. How immediate? If this story reminded you of the injustices you've seen, follow the channel and turn on notifications, because wherever justice is delayed, a new revenge story begins. Today, every instance where my personal guarantee or co-signature supports Thaddeus's ventures, every line of credit, loan, financial instrument where my backing provides legitimacy. If you withdraw simultaneously, you'll trigger cascade failures across his operation. That's the intention. My God, this will destroy him. Everything he thinks he's built. The reality is different. I'll need authorization in writing and board approval. Cornelius, as your friend, are you certain? I looked at the photograph on my desk. Thaddeus at 7, gap-toothed and grinning with his first fishing rod. That boy had loved me once. Completely certain. My attorney will deliver documentation this afternoon. By 9 a.m. I sat in Montgomery's mahogany office while his team assembled emergency protocols. Montgomery reviewed my existing will with focused intensity. Current estate leaves everything to Thaddeus. Montgomery State, the house, portfolios, business holdings, art collection, 43 million liquid, plus 18 million real property, total approximately 61 million. Thaddeus's position without my support. Montgomery pulled out a different folder based on public records, approximately 700,000 personal assets. His company shows 8 million debt secured against properties that are, he paused delicately, substantially overvalued. He's insolvent if guarantees collapse. Catastrophic. The Mount Pleasant properties are financed entirely against your co-signature. Without backing, creditors will demand immediate payment or force liquidation. He'll lose everything within 60 days. Excellent. Begin restructuring. 4 hours compressed decades of estate planning into radically different structure. The new will contained one paragraph regarding Thaddeus. To my son, Thaddeus Cornelius Ashford, I leave $1 in this message. You wished for life free from your father's limiting influence. I grant that wish with my complete estate going instead to charitable institutions that appreciate building something meaningful rather than performing independence while consuming others' sacrifices. This will trigger legal contest, Montgomery warned as I signed. Thaddeus will claim undue influence, mental incompetence, which is why Dr. Pemberton conducts comprehensive mental competency evaluation this afternoon. I want documentation of sound mind and complete legal capacity. Already scheduled, 2 p.m. Montgomery studied me with frank assessment. This isn't cruelty. This is calculated destruction. What do you hope to accomplish? Teaching my son the difference between inherited wealth and earned respect. He believed his success was independent. Soon he'll understand what independence actually means. By evening, the machinery was in motion. Harrison delivered preliminary findings, 12 pages showing every significant victory Thaddeus celebrated had been possible only through my quiet intervention. The Mount Pleasant development he'd touted as his breakthrough. I'd negotiated the land purchase and covered $2 million in unexpected costs. The historic renovation praised as visionary. My relationships with City Council, fast-track permits, the waterfront properties, financed entirely through credit lines backed by my assets. Thaddeus had built a house of cards, each stamped with my resources, relationships, reputation, and I was about to remove every card simultaneously. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m. Thaddeus's name appeared, first contact since last night. I let it ring 4 times. Father. His voice carried none of last night's bravado. We need to talk about the ceremony. Do we? I thought my existence was a limiting influence you needed to overcome. I didn't mean it like that. It was rhetoric, audience engagement. You know how speeches work. The casual dismissal of calculated cruelty as audience engagement crystallized remaining doubts into absolute certainty. I understand completely, I replied with perfect calm, and I'm sure you'll understand the changes implemented today. After all, you wanted independence. Changes? What changes? Your line of credit at Magnolia Trust withdrawn. My personal guarantees on Mount Pleasant properties rescinded. Co-signatures on construction loans revoked. Effective immediately, you have complete independence to demonstrate self-made success. Silence stretched like wire about to snap. You can't do that. Those projects are leveraged against your guarantees. Without them you'll need to demonstrate to creditors that Ashford Luxury Developments can sustain obligations independently. Isn't that what you want? This isn't about success. This is about destroying everything I've built. No, Thaddeus. This is about revealing what you actually built versus what my money constructed while you took credit. There's a difference, and you're about to learn it. Father, please, I'll apologize publicly. Just don't do this. The desperation stirred something uncomfortably close to paternal sympathy. But then I remembered last night, his triumphant expression declaring my non-existence would be a gift. Your apology is 33 years late, and motivated by financial panic rather than genuine remorse. The changes are permanent. You wanted to be self-made? Congratulations, you're about to discover what that requires. You're destroying me. I'm withdrawing support. If that destroys you, perhaps your empire wasn't as solid as you believed. I ended the call before he could respond, feeling cold satisfaction of perfect precision in delivered consequences. The next morning brought first public indication of the approaching storm. Charleston Business Journal published front-page article, questions emerge around Ashford Luxury Development's financial stability. The piece, clearly fed by Harrison's discreet inquiries, raised concerns about debt levels and undisclosed backing from established families. My phone began ringing at 7:15 a.m. I ignored every call from Thaddeus, his partners, Ophelia, let them scramble while I proceeded with next phase. Second wave hit at 10 hours in a.m. when Magnolia Trust formally notified Thaddeus that construction loans were being called due to material changes in guarantee structures, 30 days to provide alternative collateral or face foreclosure. By noon, 3 major investors requested emergency meetings about financial stability. By 2 p.m., his general contractor suspended work citing payment concerns. I tracked each domino from my office with satisfaction of someone who'd calculated exact collapse sequence. Harrison called with updates every few hours. Mr. Ashford, the Vandermeer family just withdrew bridge financing from the waterfront project, citing misrepresentation of asset backing for immediate repayment of $8 million. $8 million Thaddeus didn't have and couldn't borrow without my guarantee. Mathematical certainty of his insolvency was merely timeline question now. That evening, Ophelia Vandermeer appeared at my door, designer suit suggesting business seriousness, minimal jewelry implying gravity understanding, but her eyes betrayed calculation. She was here to negotiate for resources, not reconciliation. Mr. Ashford, may we speak? I gestured her into my study. She settled across from my desk with practiced grace. I want to acknowledge Thaddeus's speech was inappropriate, she began, offering what she thought was significant concession. He was caught up in the moment. But surely you understand it wasn't serious. Miss Vandermeer, we both know you drafted that speech. Your family's speechwriters have distinctive style, I recognized immediately. She looked momentarily uncomfortable before recovering. Perhaps I provided suggestions, but the sentiment was his. Regardless, you can't destroy his business over one speech. I'm not destroying his business. I'm withdrawing support he never acknowledged. If that destroys it, the empire was never his. You're being vindictive, punishing him for feeling suffocated by your expectation. Interesting characterization. Tell me, when you convinced your family to invest $8 million, did you mention every previous project was sustained by my intervention? Or did you allow them to believe they were backing an independent success? Her expression hardened. The Vandermeers invested based on Thaddeus's potential. Then they should have no concern collecting from a man of such potential. Without his father's limiting influence, surely his entrepreneurial brilliance will generate the $8 million needed. Ophelia stood abruptly. If you persist, you'll regret it. The Vandermeer family has significant Charleston influence. We can make your remaining years very uncomfortable. What would you do at this point? Write it in the comments. Your thoughts are as important as the story itself. Miss Vandermeer, I've lived in Charleston 6 decades and built more relationships than your family purchased with shipping money. Your threats are as empty as your fiancé's self-made claims. She left without another word. The Vandermeer involvement complicated things slightly. They had resources to sustain Thaddeus longer than I'd calculated, but their proud reputation made them vulnerable. Public revelation they'd been deceived about financial stability. Discreet conversation with Business Journal's editor, timed with Harrison's documented findings, would ensure that story received prominent coverage. The Vandermeers would react to public embarrassment by accelerating withdrawal rather than deepening commitment. 3 days later, Thaddeus appeared without announcement. He'd aged visibly confident businessman replaced by someone whose foundation was crumbling. Father, please, you've made your point. Can we discuss terms for restoring guarantees? There are no terms. The decision is permanent. Everything I've worked for will be destroyed. 7 years of building gone. 7 years of consuming my resources while claiming independent success. You're not losing what you built. You're losing what I built while you performed being self-made. His composure cracked. I know I took you for granted. I know I didn't acknowledge everything. But please, Dad, don't destroy me over one speech. I'll spend my life making this right. The word Dad struck with particular force. He hadn't used that term since college, preferring formal father. The vulnerability was real, but years too late and entirely wrong reasons. He wasn't apologizing for contempt. He was begging to resume enabling the behavior that led to contempt. Thaddeus, I'm 68 years old. I spent 33 years building your future, while you learned to view my sacrifices as limitations you heroically overcame. You wished publicly that I'd never existed. Very well, financially speaking, I no longer exist in life. You're free to demonstrate remarkable potential without your father's limiting influence. I'll lose everything. Then perhaps everything wasn't actually yours. He stood cycling through disbelief, rage, desperate calculation. I recognized that expression, figuring out how to manipulate situations to his advantage. The estate documents, he said finally. You've cut me out. Completely. The Ashford fortune will fund charitable institutions. Understanding the difference between inheritance and achievement, I'll contest it, claim undue influence, mental incompetence. I'll tie up your estate for decades. Please do. I've been evaluated by 3 independent psychiatrists, all concluding I'm of sound mind and acting with complete legal capacity. Your contest will fail, cost significant fees, and provide entertainment for Charleston's legal community. But most importantly, it will consume time and resources you don't have while creditors demand repayment. Cold calculation in his eyes was almost satisfying, watching him realize every manipulation avenue had been systematically closed. I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything? It meant everything for 33 years. Then you publicly wished I'd never exist. Actions have consequences, Thaddeus. You're about to learn that lesson with the same precision I used building the fortune you're losing. He left without another word. I watched through the window as he sat in his car, head bowed against the steering wheel. The image stirred some remaining paternal sympathy, but not enough to alter course. 7 days after graduation, final dominoes began falling. Charleston Business Journal published investigative piece detailing surprising dependencies in Ashford Luxury Development's financial structure. The Vandermeers, faced with public embarrassment over due diligence failure, immediately called their investment and filed fraud claims. 3 of Thaddeus's major projects entered foreclosure. General contractors filed mechanics liens for unpaid work. Several investors initiated misrepresentation lawsuits. The cascading collapse I'd engineered proceeded with mechanical precision, but the true masterpiece came 2 weeks later, when bankruptcy court filings revealed full insolvency, $63 million in debt against assets worth perhaps $12 million at forced sale. His entire empire, every property, every development, every carefully crafted victory, had been a house built on foundation of my credit, relationships, reputation. Without that foundation, the structure collapsed spectacularly. I sat reading court documents with satisfaction of an engineer reviewing completed blueprints. Every calculation had proven accurate. Every intervention point triggered exactly the cascade effect I'd designed. Thaddeus had wished for independence from his father's limiting influence, and I'd granted that wish with mathematical precision. Sophronia Blackwood called about the Charleston Historic Preservation endowment I'd established with $20 million from restructured estate. Cornelius, his endowment will fund historic preservation for generations. Extraordinarily generous. But I have to ask, is this really about preservation or ensuring Thaddeus sees exactly what he lost? Can't it be both? Her laugh carried understanding and admiration. "You're a complicated man." "No, Sophronia. I'm a simple man who spent 33 years being complicated by someone who viewed love as limitation. Now I'm simple again." That evening, I stood on my veranda, overlooking Charleston Harbor, watching sunset over the city I'd helped build. Somewhere in that city, my son was learning the difference between wealth and worth, between inheritance and independence, between performance and reality. He'd wished I'd never existed. Soon he'd understand my existence had been the only thing preventing his complete destruction. 3 weeks after Thaddeus's bankruptcy filing became public record, Charleston's business community had reached a consensus. The Ashford family drama represented the most spectacular financial collapse in the city's recent history. What made it particularly fascinating to observers was the surgical precision with which a father had dismantled his son's empire while maintaining absolute legal propriety. I watched the aftermath unfold from the comfortable distance of someone who'd engineered every step of the destruction. My morning routine remained unchanged: coffee on the veranda at dawn, reviewing financial reports, maintaining the various business interests I'd built over 4 decades. The only difference was the absence of Thaddeus-related obligations that had consumed so much of my attention for 33 years. The freedom was intoxicating. Harrison Blackwell's final report arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning, leather-bound and comprehensive. 200 pages documenting every financial transaction, every intervention, every instance where my resources had transformed Thaddeus's failures into apparent successes. The executive summary alone was devastating. Subject's business empire entirely dependent on undisclosed familial support. Independent viability none. Estimated timeline to complete insolvency without ongoing intervention, 47 days. Actual timeline following withdrawal of support. I'd been more accurate than even my pessimistic calculations suggested. The report included one particularly interesting discovery. Thaddeus had been secretly planning to phase me out of his public narrative. Harrison had uncovered emails between Thaddeus and a public relations firm discussing how to manage the transition from family-supported entrepreneur to self-made success story without acknowledging the support that made success possible. In other words, my son had been actively plotting to erase me from his history while still consuming my resources. The graduation speech hadn't been a momentary lapse. It had been the opening salvo in a campaign to rewrite reality. That revelation crystallized any lingering doubts about my course of action. This wasn't a father being vindictive over hurt feelings. This was necessary correction of a profound deception that had been years in the making. Montgomery Pemberton called that afternoon with an update that brought grim satisfaction. Thaddeus's attorneys filed their contest of the estate documents, exactly as we predicted. They're claiming undue influence and questioning your mental competency. And our response? Already prepared. We'll present the psychiatric evaluations, the timeline showing you acted with clear deliberation over weeks rather than impulsive reaction, and this is the coup de grace. We'll introduce Harrison's report showing the systematic deception Thaddeus practiced for years. It transforms the narrative from vindictive father to fraud victim taking appropriate action. When's the hearing? Judge Blackwood has scheduled it for 6 weeks from now. Yes, that Blackwood's Sophronia's cousin. He's known for no-nonsense approach to estate disputes and particular contempt for adult children who treat inheritance as entitlement rather than privilege. Perfect. The machinery of justice was grinding forward with the same inexorable precision I'd applied to Thaddeus's financial destruction. But wait, the real betrayal hadn't even started yet. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at my door, Ophelia Vandermeer, but transformed from our last encounter. Gone was the designer suit and confident bearing. She wore a simple dress, minimal makeup, and her eyes carried the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed future had evaporated. "Mr. Ashford, please hear me out before closing the door." I gestured her inside. curious about what desperation might reveal. She settled into my study's guest chair with none of her previous grace. The Vandermeer family has disowned me. My father says I brought shame to the family name by conducting inadequate due diligence before recommending Thaddeus's investment. He's cut off my trust fund, removed me from family business operations, and made it clear I'm no longer welcome at family functions. I'm sorry to hear that, though I fail to see how it concerns me. Thaddeus blames me for everything, she continued, her voice cracking slightly. He says if I hadn't pushed him to accept the honorary doctorate, if I hadn't helped write that speech, none of this would have happened. He's broken our engagement and is telling everyone I manipulated him into the public statements that triggered your action. The narrative Thaddeus was constructing was predictably self-serving. Ophelia's manipulative girlfriend who'd pushed him into disaster, with Thaddeus himself as victim of female influence. It was almost impressive how quickly he'd found someone else to blame. So you've lost your family, your fiancé, and your future, I observed. Again, I'm unclear why you're sharing this with me. Because I want to testify, the words came out in a rush. At the estate hearing, I want to tell Judge Blackwood the truth about Thaddeus, about how he practiced that speech for weeks, about the PR strategy to erase you from his narrative, about the way he laughed when planning the wished you'd never existed line, calling it the perfect emotional hook for the audience. I studied her carefully, looking for the manipulation angle. Ophelia hadn't suddenly developed conscience. She wanted revenge against the man who'd blamed her for his downfall. But revenge testimony could be as effective as principled testimony if properly corroborated. You understand that testifying against Thaddeus won't restore your position with the Vandermeer family? I understand, but it will hurt the man who threw me away the moment his empire collapsed. That's enough. Then you should speak with Montgomery Pemberton. He'll want to depose you formally, verify your testimony, ensure it's legally admissible. I wrote Montgomery's number on a card. But Miss Vandermeer, if you're lying, if this is some scheme you and Thaddeus cooked up to create sympathy, I will destroy you more thoroughly than I destroyed him. Do you understand? She met my eyes steadily. I understand, and I'm not lying. Thaddeus Ashford is exactly who you think he is, and worse than you probably know. After she left, I called Montgomery with the development. His response was immediate enthusiasm. Subscribe and stay tuned so you don't miss any true revenge story. Sometimes, even silence is the strongest form of revenge. This is Gold Cornelius. Testimony from his ex-fiancée about the premeditated nature of the public humiliation. Judge Blackwood will eviscerate his case. We've moved from strong position to unassailable. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of legal preparation. Montgomery deposed Ophelia for 8 hours, emerging with testimony that transformed her from scorned ex-girlfriend into credible witness. She provided emails, text messages, even audio recordings of Thaddeus practicing his graduation speech and workshopping the most hurtful phrases. Listen to this one, Montgomery said during one of our strategy sessions, playing a recording on his phone. Thaddeus's voice emerged clearly. What if I say the greatest gift would have been if you'd never existed? Too harsh or perfect for showing I've transcended family limitations? Ophelia's voice responded, perfect. It positions you as self-made while explaining why your father isn't more prominent in your narrative. Brilliant framing. The recording was dated 3 weeks before the graduation ceremony. Proof of premeditation that demolished any claim Thaddeus had been caught up in moment or spoken impulsively. Harrison Blackwell continued his investigation, uncovering additional layers of deception. Thaddeus had been shopping for biographers, looking for writers willing to tell his self-made success story without mentioning my role. He drafted social media campaigns about overcoming family obstacles to achieve dreams. He'd even consulted with branding experts about how to distance yourself from family wealth narrative while maintaining sophisticated image. Every discovery made me more certain that my actions hadn't been vindictive overreaction, but necessary correction of systematic fraud. The estate hearing arrived on a humid July morning. Charleston County Courthouse's historic courtroom was packed. Estate disputes rarely drew crowds, but the Ashford case had become public spectacle. I recognized faces from Charleston's business elite, journalists from local and regional publications, even a few academic observers from Worthington Business School. Judge Augustus Blackwood entered with the stern bearing that had made him legendary in South Carolina legal circles. 73 years old, he'd spent 4 decades on the bench developing reputation for cutting through nonsense and delivering justice with surgical precision. "This court will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber. "We're here to address Thaddeus Cornelius Ashford's contest of his father's estate plan. Let's be clear from the outset. I have no patience for adult children who believe inheritance is birthright rather than privilege." Counsel, proceed. Thaddeus's attorney, a young, ambitious lawyer named Bradford Morrison, stood with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd taken this case for publicity rather than merit. His opening statement painted Thaddeus as victim of elderly father's vindictive overreaction to one misunderstood speech. "Your Honor, my client spoke honestly about his journey to independence. For this candor, his father has attempted to destroy not just my client's inheritance, but his entire livelihood. This is elder abuse of filial relationship, weaponizing wealth to punish honesty." Judge Blackwood's expression suggested he'd heard this argument before and found it unimpressive. "Counsel, are you actually arguing that a father has obligation to fund a son who publicly wished he'd never exist?" "I'm arguing that one speech, perhaps poorly worded in the moment, doesn't justify complete destruction of family relationship and inheritance rights." "We'll see about that, Mr. Pemberton, your response." Montgomery stood with the calm authority of someone who'd practiced law for 40 years and knew he held winning hand. "Your Honor, this case isn't about one speech. It's about systematic deception spanning years, culminating in calculated public humiliation. We'll demonstrate that Thaddeus Ashford deliberately constructed false narrative of self-made success while consuming his father's resources, then attempted to erase his father from his history entirely." "Strong accusation, Counselor. Can you support it?" "We can, Your Honor, extensively." The next 3 hours consisted of Montgomery methodically presenting evidence, Harrison's financial report showing every instance of my intervention, bank records documenting millions in guarantees and transfers, emails between Thaddeus and PR firms about managing the family narrative, text messages where Thaddeus laughed about his father's small-minded conventionality. But the devastation truly began when Ophelia took the stand. She described in clinical detail how Thaddeus had workshopped the graduation speech for maximum emotional impact, how he'd specifically targeted phrases designed to humiliate me while establishing his independence narrative, how he'd practiced the delivery to ensure it would seem spontaneous rather than calculated. "Did Mr. Ashford express any concern about how this speech might affect his father?" Montgomery asked. "No," Ophelia replied clearly. "He said his father was too weak to do anything about it, and that public humiliation would make it easier to phase him out of the success narrative entirely." Bradford Morrison objected repeatedly, but Judge Blackwood overruled each objection with increasing impatience. The testimony was relevant, credible, and devastating. "Did Mr. Ashford discuss his father's financial support?" Montgomery continued. "Constantly, but only private. He called it the price of being born into mediocrity, and joked that his father's money was the only useful thing his father had ever provided." Across the courtroom, I watched Thaddeus's face cycle through emotions: shock that Ophelia was testifying against him, rage at her betrayal, and finally desperate calculation about how to counter this damage. The final blow came when Montgomery introduced the audio recording of Thaddeus practicing his "wished you'd never existed" line. Hearing my son's voice casually workshopping the most hurtful possible phrasing, treating my public humiliation as creative exercise, created a silence in the courtroom that felt almost physical. Judge Blackwood's expression had progressed from stern to openly disgusted. "Mr. Morrison, Does your client wish to testify in his own defense? Bradford Morrison conferred with Thaddeus in urgent whispers before responding, "Yes, Your Honor. My client deserves opportunity to explain context." Thaddeus took the stand with visible effort at composure, but the confident businessman from the graduation ceremony had been replaced by someone whose world was collapsing in real time. "Miss Ashford," Montgomery began his cross-examination with deceptive gentleness, "you've heard extensive testimony about your father's financial support over 3 decades. Do you dispute any of the specific instances documented?" "No, but that's what parents do. They support their children." "Support, yes. But do parents typically provide $61 million in direct support and loan guarantees while being told they're limiting influences who should never have existed? That's taking it out of context. What context makes wishing your father had never existed acceptable?" Thaddeus floundered, searching for answer that didn't exist. It was rhetorical flourish. Anyone who understood public speaking would recognize. "We have audio of you practicing that line for maximum impact. We have emails about your PR strategy to erase your father from your narrative. We have testimony from multiple witnesses about your systematic deception." "What context explains that?" "My father was controlling." "How was he controlling?" "By funding your MBA, by guaranteeing your business loans, by covering millions in cost overruns when your innovative approaches failed. He had expectations." "What expectations?" "That you acknowledge his support, that you treat him with basic respect." Montgomery's voice hardened. Or was his real crime simply existing while you tried to perform being self-made? The courtroom was silent. Thaddeus had no answer that wouldn't further condemn him. Judge Blackwood intervened. "Mr. Ashford, I've heard enough. Your behavior represents everything wrong with entitled children who mistake inheritance for achievement. Your father's decision to restructure his estate isn't vindictive. It's appropriate response to systematic deception and disrespect." "Your Honor, please, I'm not finished. You stood before Charleston's business community and declared that your father's existence was obstacle you'd heroically overcome. Very well, you've overcome him. His estate will go to institutions that appreciate the difference between support and limitation. Your contest is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm ordering you to pay all legal costs associated with this proceeding, including your father's attorney fees." The gavel struck with finality. Around the courtroom, observers whispered and typed on phones, spreading news of the complete demolition of Thaddeus's case. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. As people filed out, Thaddeus sat motionless at the defendant's table, the full magnitude of his loss finally registering. He'd gambled everything on this contest. His last chance to reclaim some portion of the fortune he believed was rightfully his. Now he had nothing, no inheritance, no business empire, and an additional 6-figure legal bill he couldn't possibly pay. I stood to leave, and for a moment our eyes met across the courtroom. I saw in his expression something I'd never seen before, genuine understanding of consequences, not regret for his actions. Thaddeus was too fundamentally selfish for that, but comprehension that he'd destroyed himself through arrogance and deception. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Montgomery and me. I gave a brief statement that had been carefully prepared to sound magnanimous while ensuring no one misunderstood the justice of the outcome. My son wished for independence from his father's influence. I've granted that wish completely. What he builds from here will truly be his own achievement without the foundation he never acknowledged having. That evening, I sat on my veranda watching Charleston Harbor's sunset, Montgomery beside me with glasses of 40-year-old bourbon. "You know, the legal community will study this case for years," Montgomery observed. "Perfect execution of estate planning as tool for justice rather than mere wealth transfer. I didn't do this for the legal community. I did it because my son needed to learn that respect can't be purchased, but absence can be chosen. Will you ever reconcile?" That would require Thaddeus developing capacity for genuine remorse rather than regret at being caught. Based on his courtroom testimony, that transformation seems unlikely. What will you do with the estate now? $20 million to Charleston Historic Preservation as planned. $20 million to establish scholarships for students from genuinely modest backgrounds who understand the value of opportunity. The remainder is split between medical research and arts funding. Every dollar will go to people who appreciate support rather than performing independence while consuming it. Montgomery raised his glass to appropriate consequences, delivered with precision. We drank as the sun painted the harbor in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in this city, Thaddeus was beginning to understand what life without support actually meant. Not the performed independence of his graduation speech, but the brutal reality of no safety net, no guarantees, no quiet interventions, saving him from his own incompetence. The first reports of his struggle emerged within weeks. Bankruptcy proceedings forced liquidation of his remaining assets. The Mount Pleasant properties sold at significant loss, generating barely enough to satisfy secured creditors. His luxury apartment was surrendered. The Italian suits, the expensive watches, all auctioned to pay debts. Harrison Blackwell provided updates with the thoroughness I'd come to expect. Subject has moved to studio apartment in North Charleston, working as sales associate at luxury real estate firm, making approximately $45,000 annually, first legitimate employment in his adult life. How's he handling it? Reports suggest poorly. Coworkers describe him as bitter, resentful, constantly talking about how he used to be somebody. No apparent self-reflection about how he got there. That confirmed my assessment. Thaddeus had learned consequences, but not the lesson behind them. He understood he'd lost everything, but not why he'd deserved to lose it. 3 months after the hearing, Sophronia Blackwood invited me to lunch at Charleston's most exclusive club. Over she crab soup and perfectly chilled chablis, she raised the question I'd been expecting. Cornelius, do you have any regrets? Any moments where you wish you'd shown mercy? If Thaddeus had shown genuine remorse, not panic about losing resources, but actual understanding of how his behavior had been wrong, perhaps I would have relented, but he never did. Even at the hearing, his testimony was about justifying his actions rather than acknowledging fault. The Charleston Historic Preservation Endowment has already funded 3 major projects, Sophronia said. Your $20 million will preserve more history than any single donation in the organization's existence. That's meaningful legacy. More meaningful than funding my son's continued performance of being self-made while consuming my resources. That surprised me. My ex-wife had disappeared from Charleston 15 years ago after our divorce, remarried someone in Atlanta, and shown no interest in Thaddeus's life beyond perfunctory holiday cards. What did she want? According to mutual friends, she's furious about the estate restructuring. Apparently, she'd been counting on Thaddeus inheriting substantial wealth that he'd promised to share with her. Now she's threatening her own lawsuit, claiming some obligation to her as former spouse. Let her try. Our divorce settlement was comprehensive and final. She has no legal standing, and any attorney worth their fees will tell her so. She's hired Bradford Morrison. I laughed, genuine amusement at the perfect symmetry. Then she'll lose with the same incompetence that characterized her son's case. Morrison is excellent at self-promotion but mediocre at actual legal work. The legal threats from my ex-wife ultimately proved as empty as I'd predicted. Her attorney reviewed the divorce settlement, recognized the case had no merit, and quietly withdrew. But the attempt itself was illuminating. Even Thaddeus's mother saw him primarily as means to access my wealth rather than person worth supporting independently. Perhaps his entitled worldview had been shaped by more than just my enabling. Perhaps both his parents had failed him in different ways, I through excessive support, his mother through transactional love. The realization brought no comfort, only sad recognition that some damage was too fundamental to repair. A year after the graduation ceremony, I received unexpected letter forwarded from Montgomery's office. Thaddeus's handwriting, but different somehow, less confident, more careful. Father, I'm writing because my attorney advised me this would help establish grounds for future reconciliation. But I'm going to ignore that advice and tell you the truth instead. I don't want reconciliation. I don't miss you. What I miss is the money, the security, the lifestyle your support provided. If you called tomorrow offering to restore everything, I'd accept immediately, not because I've learned anything or changed fundamentally, but because being poor is miserable and I hate it. But I understand that's not happening. The estate hearing made that clear. You've moved on with your life, funding causes that appreciate support in ways I never did. That's probably appropriate, though I'll never stop resenting it. This letter isn't apology or request. It's acknowledgement. You were right. I built nothing. I performed independence while consuming your resources. The graduation speech wasn't spontaneous honesty. It was calculated public humiliation designed to erase you from my narrative. I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't caught up in the moment. I chose those words carefully to hurt you while positioning myself as self-made success. That was cruel, and I understood it was cruel when I was doing it. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry it didn't work. That's the truth you probably already knew, but I'm confirming explicit. I would make the same choices again if I could have kept the money. I suppose that makes me exactly who you concluded I was. Fair enough. Thaddeus, I read the letter 3 times, feeling complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Thaddeus had finally achieved complete honesty. Not redemptive honesty pointing toward growth, but honest acknowledgement of his fundamental selfishness. Most people would find the letter disturbing. I found it oddly respectful in its refusal to perform remorse he didn't feel. For the first time in his adult life, Thaddeus had told me unvarnished truth about who he was. I filed the letter in my personal records without responding. What would be the point? Thaddeus had confirmed everything I'd concluded about his character. Any response would only create false hope of reconciliation that neither of us actually wanted. Instead, I focused on the life I'd built in the years since his destruction. The Charleston Historic Preservation Endowment had saved 3 buildings from demolition. The scholarship fund had sent 8 students from genuinely modest backgrounds to college. The medical research funding had contributed to breakthrough in cardiac surgery that would save countless lives. Every dollar of my fortune was generating more value in its new purposes than it ever had subsidizing Thaddeus's illusions. Montgomery called one afternoon with final piece of legal closure. Bradford Morrison tried one last petition claiming the estate restructuring violated some obscure statute. Judge Blackwood didn't even bother with hearing, denied it from the bench with written rebuke about frivolous filings. That's the last legal avenue. Your estate plan is untouchable now. Excellent. Send Morrison a case of wine for his incompetence. He's made this process far easier than it might have been with competent opposition. That evening I stood on my veranda with Sophronia Blackwood, who'd become close friend during the year's events. She'd seen me through the darkest moments of public humiliation and emerged as genuine ally rather than social connection. "Do you think Thaddeus will ever understand what he lost?" she asked. Watching the harbor lights reflect on water, he understands he lost money and security. Whether he'll ever understand he lost chance at genuine relationship with his father, I doubt it. That would require valuing relationships beyond their utility. You seem at peace with that. I am. Thaddeus made his choices with full knowledge of consequences. I've made mine. The only difference is that my choices were calculated to teach necessary lesson, while his were calculated to take maximum advantage. History will judge which approach was more justified. Charleston certainly has. Sophronia raised her glass. You're more respected now than before all this started. The business community admires someone who enforces boundaries even with family. That's gratifying, though it wasn't the primary motivation. What was? Teaching my son that respect can't be performed or purchased, only earned through genuine appreciation. He never learned that lesson, but at least I stopped subsidizing his ignorance. The last time I saw Thaddeus was 2 years after his graduation ceremony. Purely by chance, we ended up in the same restaurant, Charleston's finest seafood establishment, where I was hosting dinner from major donors to the Historic Preservation Fund. Thaddeus was there with colleagues from his real estate firm, clearly trying to impress potential clients. When our eyes met across the dining room, something passed between us, acknowledgement without warmth, recognition without reconciliation. He'd aged noticeably in 2 years. The expensive suits replaced with department store versions. The confident bearing diminished into careful professional persona of someone who'd learned to fake confidence rather than assume it. He was, finally, working for success rather than performing it. As my party left, I paused briefly at his table. Thaddeus, father. He stood with reflexive politeness rather than genuine warmth. I hope you're well, very well, and you? Managing, learning what genuine work actually requires. Good, that's appropriate education. Nothing more needed to be said. I continued toward the exit, aware that everyone in the restaurant was watching this interaction, speculating about whether reconciliation might be approaching. But reconciliation would require something neither of us possessed. Thaddeus would need genuine remorse rather than resentment about being caught, and I would need willingness to forgive someone who'd explicitly stated he'd make the same choices again given the opportunity. Some lessons aren't about forgiveness, they're about appropriate consequences delivered with precision. Thaddeus had wished I'd never existed, had planned that public humiliation with calculated cruelty. I'd granted his wish by removing every support system that had made his comfortable existence possible. He didn't raise his voice, because justice had already spoken. Now he lived with the reality of genuine independence, working for modest salary, earning rather than inheriting respect, building something real rather than performing, being self-made while consuming others' resources. That evening, sitting on my veranda with bourbon and satisfaction, I reflected on the complex mathematics of family, love. I'd destroyed my son financially, legally, and reputationally, but I'd done so in response to his public declaration that my existence was an obstacle he'd heroically overcome. The question I'd asked myself repeatedly over 2 years, was this revenge or justice? The answer remained the same, both, and appropriately so. Justice doesn't preclude satisfaction when correctly delivered. Revenge isn't wrong when it's measured response to calculated cruelty. Thaddeus had learned that actions have consequences. I'd learned that enabling disrespect in the name of love produces neither respect nor love. We'd both received appropriate education, and Charleston had witnessed how a father with resources and precision could enforce boundaries even his own son couldn't cross. The Charleston harbor stretched before me, lights reflecting on water like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in that city, my son was learning lessons I should have decades earlier. Better late than never, though the education had been more expensive than necessary. But then the most important lessons usually are. 3 years later, I died peacefully in my sleep at 71. The funeral was well attended. Business leaders, Preservation Society members, scholarship recipients whose lives I'd changed, medical researchers whose work I'd funded. Thaddeus attended, sitting in the back row rather than with family. He left immediately after the service without speaking to anyone. Montgomery later reported that he'd looked profoundly alone, exactly the independence he'd claimed to want. My estate executed precisely as planned. Charitable organizations received $61 million that would preserve history, educate deserving students, and advance medical knowledge. Thaddeus received his $1 and the letter I'd written to be delivered upon my death. Thaddeus, if you're reading this, I've died without reconciling with you. That was not accidental. Over 33 years, you taught me that enabling disrespect produces more disrespect. I finally learned that lesson. You wished I'd never exist. I granted that wish by removing every support that made your comfortable existence possible. You called that revenge. I called it appropriate consequences. What you built afterward, if you built anything, is actually, that's the greatest gift I could give you. The requirement to earn rather than inherit, to build rather than perform building. I don't forgive you. I don't resent you. I simply made peace with who you are and enforced boundaries. If this estate distribution angers you, remember, you wished I'd never existed. This is what that wish actually means. Your father. Montgomery told me later that Thaddeus tried one final time to contest the estate, claiming the posthumous letter demonstrated ongoing vindictiveness that invalidated testamentary capacity. Judge Blackwood denied the motion without hearing and imposed additional sanctions for frivolous filing. Some people never learn, but that was no longer my concern. Justice, as I'd learned, isn't about redemption or reconciliation. It's about appropriate consequences delivered with precision. I'd spent 33 years enabling someone who viewed love as limitation. The last 3 years of my life, I'd enforced boundaries that should have been established decades earlier. Which version of fatherhood was more loving? The one that enabled comfortable disrespect, or the one that forced uncomfortable growth? History would judge. But I died at peace with my choices, knowing that every dollar of my fortune would serve people who appreciated support rather than someone who'd weaponized it while performing independence. And that ultimately was the only judgment that mattered. Thank you for watching. If this story showed you a different face of justice, like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next revenge story.